somebody sent in the question, and this is a specific question to their situation, but I think it's good for me to give a generic answer for the benefit of everybody. Here's their specific question. My parents divorced as a result of adultery. They both claim to be Christians and actively go to church. How should I interpret Mark 10, verses 11 to 12? If they remarry, are they actively living in sin? And how should I love/respect them without acting like I support the decision? First, these texts come in anonymously unless somebody gives us their name. Whoever sent this in sounds more spiritually mature than their parents. And so I commend whoever sent the question in because you're asking questions that are important. So without knowing all of the details about this particular situation, let me refer to the passage that this person quoted, and then I'm just going to mention real quickly, because it's a sensitive topic, but the Bible addresses every topic in our lives, and so it's good to know these things. So Mark 10, 11, and 12 says this. Jesus said, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." One of the benefits we have of having four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is that they don't contradict, they complement. So when you look at Matthew and what Matthew said in terms of what Jesus said regarding divorce and adultery, he inserts something that's important in the conversation. Matthew 19:9, Jesus said, "Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." And so it's important to understand, and listen, obviously when I'm talking to any group, just national statistics, and it's very similar in the church, I'm afraid to say, about 50% of marriages end in divorce. So obviously this is going to impact perhaps half of the crowd at least. But it is good and important to know what the Bible says about the subject of divorce and remarriage. Let me say this first. People who have a messed up life and messed up relationships prior to coming to know Christ, it's a new slate when you come to know Christ. So if you have been married and divorced prior to knowing Christ, it's a new beginning for you now that you know Christ. The greater accountability is for those of us who already know Christ, because we have a higher standard by which to live. And like it or not, the Bible only gives two clauses for divorce. One is, as I just quoted from Matthew 19:9, sexual immorality. Now, the Greek word is porneia. That can cover a lot of kinds of immorality. But, the question was primarily about adultery. So adultery is an acceptable reason, according to the Bible, for divorce. That doesn't mean that if there was adultery, you should get divorced. I've seen God do a lot of wonderful healing, restoring work in relationships where there has been adultery. But it is a clause for divorce if all other things have been exhausted in trying to keep the relationship together. The only other clause that is given to us is 1 Corinthians 7:15, where Paul, by inspiration of the Spirit, talks about an unbelieving spouse decides to abandon the marriage. Then the other spouse who is left is free to remarry. Those are the only clauses given. Now, I understand there's a whole lot of nuances. What about alcoholism? And what about, physical abuse and all this? There might be reasons for separation. But even then in 1 Corinthians 7, it speaks about if a couple separates, they should remain unmarried or reconcile. The problem with marriages and the subject of divorce in America is we are all interested in our happiness. Can I just tell you, to quote, I guess, a line I'm thinking in my head right now from Ben Shapiro, the facts don't care about your feelings. Can I just tell you that the Bible does not ever talk about how happiness is a goal? It just doesn't. Jesus never encouraged you to be happy. Life is filled with pain. Life is filled with rough spots. And sometimes people need to remain married to honor God, even though it's not a very happy relationship. Because the goal in our lives as Christians, okay, I'm not speaking to the general world population. I'm talking about as believers, we have a higher standard by which to live. The goal is holiness, not happiness. And Jesus spoke about three things that he wanted to impart to people: my joy, my peace, and my love. He never talked about happiness. So we have this Western mindset: I want to be happy, and if I'm not happy, I'm going to bail in this relationship. If you're a believer, that's a cop-out. We are called to do sometimes the difficult things that are honoring to God. So, as a believer, unless there is a clause of sexual sin, sexual immorality, or an unbeliever has abandoned the marriage, you're not free to remarry. This is a high standard by which to live. Everything that Christ tells us to do is a high standard. And yet this is what causes us, when we walk in obedience, to honor the Lord even when it is super, super difficult. So I don't know the case of this particular question. It almost sounds like both spouses committed adultery. I don't know. If one committed adultery, the one who did not commit adultery is free to remarry. But there's a lot of nuances to every relationship that's somewhat difficult to answer. But I'm just giving you what the Bible says, and let that sink in and settle where it needs to settle. But marriage and divorce and adultery, it's messy. I get it. I have compassion for families that have gone through that, or are going through it, or sorting it out. It's painful. Divorce is like a death. In many respects. It's super difficult for people to go through. There's grace. But as Christians, we have to be aware of what God's standard is and do our best to live according to it. All right.